a cold mist curled over the battlefield. The clatter of armor was gone, replaced only by the faint hiss of the wind dragging loose arrow feathers across the dirt. In the distance, a lone samurai stood motionless, helmet tucked beneath his arm, eyes fixed on the horizon. His sword, though stained with battle, rested quietly in its scabbard. Around him lay the echoes of chaos, broken yari spears, abandoned banners, and the hushed groans of the wounded. And yet, this warrior's stillness was not hesitation. It was resolve, the kind that came not from orders but from an oath no one had written and almost no one dared to speak aloud. This is where our story begins, not in the famous lines of the Hagakure, or in the well-worn code of Bushido that fills modern textbooks, but in the shadows of a forgotten code of honor, one that guided the samurai when Bushido's rules fell silent. The myth and the mask. Today, when we think of the samurai, we picture stoic warriors bound by an unbreakable code, loyalty to one's lord, courage in battle, the dignity of death over dishonor. Bushido, the way of the warrior, has become a cultural shorthand for all these virtues. But the reality was never so simple. Bushido, as most of us know it, was not a single, unchanging doctrine passed down through generations. It was a patchwork of ideals, reshaped again and again by politics, religion, and necessity. In times of peace, it was polished into philosophy, in times of war, it was hardened into survival. And somewhere between those two extremes, another code quietly took root, one that cared less for rigid hierarchy and more for personal integrity. This silent oath was not recited in courtrooms or inked into scrolls. It was carried in the private decisions a samurai made when no one was watching, to spare a worthy foe, to keep a dangerous secret, to protect an enemy's family even when duty demanded cruelty. It was a human code, not an institutional one, and that made it dangerous to the authorities, who preferred obedience over compassion. From war to uneasy peace. To understand why this hidden code emerged, we have to step into the turning point of samurai history, the transition from the brutal Sengoku Jidai, the warring states period, to the Edo period under Tokugawa rule. For nearly a century before Tokugawa Ieyasu's victory at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, Japan was torn apart by constant war. Samurai lived in a world where betrayal could come at any hour, and survival meant both skill with a blade and the ability to navigate shifting alliances. In that chaos, loyalty was often personal rather than political. A warrior fought for the man he trusted, not necessarily the clan he served. But after Tokugawa's unification, everything changed. War was no longer the defining feature of samurai life. The shogunate imposed strict social order, and the sword, once a weapon of survival, became more a symbol of class. Samurai became administrators, bureaucrats, and peacekeepers. Publicly, they were still expected to embody Bushido, but in practice they lived in a world where political obedience outweighed personal honor. A code between the lines. This was the moment when the forgotten code mattered most. The official Bushido, promoted by the Tokugawa government, served the interests of the shogunate, unquestioning loyalty to one's lord, suppression of dissent, and a willingness to sacrifice oneself for the stability of the regime. But many samurai, raised in the chaos of the Sengoku era or schooled in older traditions, clung to a more individualized sense of justice. They believed a warrior's worth wasn't measured solely by his lord's satisfaction, but by his ability to live, and die, without shame in his own heart. Sometimes that meant following orders. Sometimes it meant defying them. And such defiance was dangerous. The shogunate didn't execute samurai simply for thinking differently, but history is full of tales where a warrior's quiet choice, to save an enemy, to refuse a duel, to speak truth to power, was enough to end his career or his life. And yet, these were the choices that defined the forgotten code. Legends and shadows. Some of these moments became quiet legends, a commander ordering his men to let a defeated enemy withdraw because the man had fought with honor, a retainer risking his life to smuggle food to a rival clan's starving villagers, a warrior refusing to draw his blade against an unarmed opponent, even when taunted in front of his peers. These acts rarely made the official records. In fact, many were erased or rewritten to fit the shogunate's idealized version of samurai duty. And so, the forgotten code survived only in whispers, in family stories, in unrecorded acts of mercy, in the private memoirs of men who knew that real honor couldn't always be worn like armor. The first question: the truth is, Bushido was never the only moral compass a samurai carried. There were moments when the path laid out by Bushido was too rigid, too bound to the political needs of the time. And when that happened, the forgotten code, flexible, deeply personal, and often costly, stepped in to fill the silence. As we leave this mist-covered battlefield and step deeper into history, we carry one question forward: in a world where loyalty to power often meant betraying one's own conscience, which oath truly defined a samurai? The answer begins in the blood and ink of the Sengoku era, the chaotic birth of both Bushido as we know it, and the hidden rules that lived in its shadow. The origins of the samurai's forgotten code do not lie in the serene gardens and orderly courts of the Edo period. They were forged in fire, in the smoke of burning villages, the cries of betrayed allies, and the endless shifting of banners on chaotic battlefields. To understand this silent oath, we must return to the Sengoku Jidai, Japan's age of the country at war, which stretched from the mid-15th century into the dawn of the 17th. This was a time when Japan fractured into dozens of warring domains. Alliances could dissolve overnight. A sworn brother one year could be your mortal enemy the next. In such a world, survival depended not only on skill with the yari or the katana but on something more dangerous: the ability to judge who could be trusted when there was no law but the sword. Philosophy amid chaos. Even in the violence of the Sengoku period, ideas mattered. The samurai were not simply brutes. Their worldview was shaped by a blend of Zen Buddhism's calm discipline, Confucian ethics of loyalty and hierarchy, and Shinto reverence for nature and ancestry. These philosophies did not exist in separate boxes, they intertwined, sometimes harmonizing, sometimes contradicting each other. Zen taught detachment from fear and death, helping warriors keep a steady mind in battle. Confucianism drilled the importance of loyalty, but to whom that loyalty was owed was not always clear. Shinto instilled a sense of belonging to the land and the spirits that inhabited it, giving battles an almost sacred weight. From this philosophical mix emerged the first seeds of the hidden code, rules a warrior followed not because they were ordered to, but because they aligned with something older than politics: personal honor, rooted in both morality and tradition. The Contradictions of Honor. History offers us portraits of great warlords whose lives embodied these contradictions. Takeda Shingen, the Tiger of Kai, was ruthless in strategy, yet famed for sparing enemy civilians. Usuji Kenshin, his great rival, once sent salt to Shingen's clan during a shortage, declaring, "Wars should be won with swords, not with rice." These acts defied the cold logic of war, but they were remembered because they spoke to an honor that could not be commanded from above. Then there was Miyamoto Musashi, the wandering duelist who lived without a master for most of his life. Musashi's path rejected much of the formalized Bushido that later became law. He embodied the idea that honor was forged through personal trial, not in the pages of an official doctrine. A code written nowhere. The forgotten code did not appear in legal documents. It was transmitted through example, in the stories retainers told to their sons, in the discreet actions of warriors who risked everything to keep a promise that served no lord's interest. These unwritten rules were flexible, often tailored to a man's own moral compass. It could mean avenging a friend even when the clan forbade it. It could mean protecting an enemy's heir to preserve the dignity of a defeated house. It could mean refusing a duel if the challenger was driven by arrogance rather than necessity. The cost of such choices was often high: exile, loss of stipend, or even execution. But in the minds of those who followed it, this was true samurai honor, a loyalty not to power, but to principle. The transition to peace. When Tokugawa Ieyasu unified Japan in 1600, ending the Sengoku era, this hidden code faced its greatest test. Peace stripped the samurai of their constant battles and replaced them with ceremonial duties, court politics, and bureaucratic service. Official Bushido became a tool of the shogunate, a means to keep warriors obedient and the social hierarchy intact. Yet the habits of the Sengoku generation did not vanish overnight. Veterans of the warring states carried their private codes into this new world, passing them to apprentices and heirs who would never see open battle. And while the shogunate preferred the tidy, state-approved version of samurai honor, the old ways, the unspoken rules born of blood and necessity, lived on in whispers. From here, our path moves into the heart of that hidden code, the invisible rules of mercy, vengeance, and restraint that guided a samurai's hand when official doctrine failed. If Bushido was the law written in scrolls, the Forgotten Code was the law written in silence. It governed what happened after the clash of steel, in moments when the victors stood over the defeated and a choice had to be made, not by decree, but by conscience. Mercy in the shadow of the blade. Among the unspoken rules, mercy stood first, not as softness, but as a calculated respect for those who had fought with valor. A samurai who spared a worthy foe risked being seen as weak by his peers, yet such mercy could carry its own kind of power. One story tells of a retainer under Date Masamune, the one-eyed dragon of the north, who captured an enemy officer during a night raid. By the laws of war, the man's life was forfeit. But the retainer, impressed by the officer's composure and refusal to beg, released him under the cover of darkness. Years later, when Date's forces were ambushed, it was this same officer, now serving in another clan, who delayed his troops just long enough for Date to escape. Mercy in this code was not sentimentality, it was an investment in honor that might return in unexpected ways. Vengeance with boundaries. Vengeance was another pillar of the hidden code, but it was not blind. A samurai could pursue revenge, but the target had to be worthy of it. Petty slights were ignored, dishonor was reserved for those who betrayed trust or defiled sacred bonds. The famous case of the 47 Ronin is often framed as a tale of Bushido loyalty, but within the Forgotten Code their act was more complex. These men avenged their lord not simply because law demanded it, in fact, the law forbade it, but because their sense of personal honor outweighed the edicts of the shogunate. In their eyes, to live without redressing the insult was a deeper disgrace than death itself. The rule of restraint. Perhaps the most surprising rule was restraint, the decision not to fight at all. In the samurai world, duels were both a way to settle disputes and a dangerous display of skill. But the hidden code valued dignity over showmanship. A warrior might refuse a duel if the challenger sought glory rather than justice, or if the contest would needlessly endanger his comrades. An account from the early Edo period describes a retainer of the Hosokawa clan who, after being publicly insulted, simply bowed and walked away. Days later, he quietly challenged the offender in private, defeating him without killing him. This not only preserved his own dignity, but also prevented a public feud that could have destabilized his lord's position. The price of choice. These invisible rules carried real risks. Mercy could be seen as disloyalty. Controlled vengeance could look like weakness. Refusal to duel could invite whispers of cowardice. Yet those who followed the Forgotten Code accepted these risks because, to them, honor lived in the eyes of the self, not in the applause of others. The shogunate never acknowledged these principles. They lived only in the actions of individuals, moments when a samurai's conscience outweighed his obedience. As we move forward, the stage shifts to the Edo period's growing tensions, when the shogunate's official code began to clash violently with these personal oaths, and honor itself became a weapon in the hands of those who ruled. By the mid-Edo period, peace had lasted for generations. The clang of armies on open fields had faded into the rhythmic formality of court life, and with it came a dangerous transformation. Honor was no longer just lived, it was performed. The Tokugawa shogunate had perfected the art of using Bushido as a political tool. Officially, it was a code of loyalty, discipline, and sacrifice. In reality, it was a method of control, a way to ensure that the warrior class served the regime without question. And for those samurai who still followed the Forgotten Code, this meant living in a constant state of quiet rebellion. The theater of loyalty. In this era, honor was as much about appearances as it was about action. Ceremonies, public displays of devotion, and rigid adherence to protocol became measures of a man's worth. A samurai might be praised for kneeling perfectly at court while privately scheming against his lord. Another might be scorned for breaking etiquette, even if his intentions were pure. The Forgotten Code, rooted in conscience rather than spectacle, often clashed with these staged performances. For those who refused to play the part, the consequences could be devastating. The AKO incident, loyalty or defiance. Nothing illustrates this tension more vividly than the infamous AKO incident of 1701 to 1703, better known as the story of the 47 Ronin. When Lord Asano Naganori was provoked by Kira Yashinaka into drawing his sword in Edo Castle, a grave crime, he was ordered to commit seppuku, and his retainers were left masterless. According to shogunate law, they were forbidden from taking revenge. According to the official Bushido, their loyalty was now to the shogunate's judgment. But the Ronin chose a different path, one aligned with the Forgotten Code. For nearly 2 years, they plotted in secret, waiting until their enemies believed them broken. Then, in the dead of winter, they struck, killing Kira and laying his head at their lord's grave. To the common people, this was the ultimate act of honor. To the shogunate, it was a dangerous example of warriors placing personal oaths above the law. The Ronin were ordered to commit seppuku. Even in death, they divided opinion: were they heroes or rebels? The truth depended on which code you believed in. Honor as a political trap. The shogunate knew that Bushido could be turned into a weapon, not against enemies on the battlefield, but against the samurai themselves. Lords could demand impossible acts of loyalty, knowing their retainers would obey or face disgrace. Rival factions could engineer situations where a warrior's refusal to follow an order would tarnish his name, forcing him into exile or ritual suicide. One chilling case involved a retainer ordered to execute an old comrade accused of treason. The accused had once saved his life in battle. Under the Forgotten Code, mercy was the clear choice. But under the shogunate's Bushido, refusal meant dishonor to one's house. The retainer obeyed, his face like stone, and later, according to private letters, he never touched his sword again. The price of defiance. Defying the shogunate's code did not always mean open rebellion. Sometimes it was as subtle as protecting a rival clan's heir in secret, or leaking false information to spare innocents from punishment. Yet each act was a gamble. If discovered, it could mean loss of rank, confiscation of lands, or execution. The Forgotten Code thrived only in these shadows, where its followers balanced on the knife's edge between survival and disgrace. But as the 18th and 19th centuries unfolded, the tension became unbearable. The samurai class itself was changing, and so was Japan. As the currents of foreign trade, Western weapons, and political reform began to erode the Tokugawa order, the samurai faced a new and final test. Could the Forgotten Code survive in a world where the sword was no longer the measure of a man? The answer would come in the twilight years of the samurai, when a dying class made one last stand for a way of life already slipping into legend. The mid-19th century brought winds that even the strongest samurai could not hold back. Black ships appeared on Japan's shores, their steam engines hissing like dragons from a foreign world. The arrival of Commodore Perry in 1853 cracked open the gates of isolation, ushering in an age of diplomacy backed by cannon fire. Inside Japan, the Tokugawa shogunate faltered under the pressure. Old alliances strained, domains split between loyalty to the shogun and loyalty to the emperor. For the samurai, this was no longer the chessboard of clan rivalries they had known for centuries. It was a new game entirely, one where the rules of Bushido were clashing with the demands of modern politics and foreign negotiation. A warrior without a war. For those who followed the Forgotten Code, the Meiji Restoration, 1868, was a death sentence, not just to their class, but to their very identity. The emperor's new government abolished the samurai's privileges, stripped them of stipends, and banned the wearing of swords in public. The katana, once a living extension of a warrior's soul, became little more than a family heirloom. Some adapted, becoming soldiers in the modern army or officials in the new bureaucracy. But others could not bend. For them, the sword was not simply a weapon, it was a symbol of a promise made to their ancestors, a covenant with the code they carried in silence. The last duels of dignity. In these twilight years, a few warriors still clung to the old ways, even knowing it would lead to ruin. One account tells of a retainer who, after refusing to enforce a corrupt governor's orders, challenged him to a duel, fully aware the new laws made such combat illegal. The duel was fought at dawn in a bamboo grove. The retainer won, but was arrested and executed for defying the imperial edict. In his final statement, he wrote, "Better to die for the truth than live under a lie." Such acts were no longer celebrated as they might have been in the Sengoku era. Now, they were seen as archaic, even foolish. Yet they were also the purest expressions of the forgotten code, loyalty not to lord or law, but to personal honor. The quiet fade by the late 19th century, these figures had all but disappeared. Their code lived only in memoirs, in fading ink on yellowed paper, and in the whispered stories of families who remembered an ancestor's impossible choice. Japan raced toward modernity, and the world remembered the samurai mostly through romanticized tales of Bushido, the official version, neat and polished. But beneath that surface lay the ghosts of warriors who had fought not just for power, but for a truth too fragile to survive the new age. From here, we arrive at the final reflection, a meditation on why this code mattered, why it was buried, and what its lessons mean in our own age of shifting loyalties. The forgotten code of the samurai was never meant to be immortal. It was too human, too flexible, too dangerous to survive in a world that rewards obedience over conscience. And yet, in ways subtle and unseen, it endures. You won't find it carved in stone or bound in leather. You'll find it in the moments when a person refuses to betray a friend for personal gain, when compassion triumphs over ambition, when truth is spoken at the cost of comfort. The samurai who followed this silent oath were not perfect men, they were flawed, conflicted, and often doomed. But in choosing integrity over expedience, they left behind a legacy that outlasted their class. History chose to elevate the polished image of Bushido, a neat package of loyalty and sacrifice, because it served the needs of power. The forgotten code was different. It placed human dignity above political survival, and in doing so, it challenged the very systems that sought to define honor from the top down. In the rush of modern life, it is easy to believe such ideals are relics, too fragile for the present. But perhaps that is the greatest misunderstanding. The forgotten code was never about swords or armor, it was about the courage to act when rules fall silent. And so, when we think of the samurai, we should remember not just the warriors who died for their lords, but those who risked everything to live by their own truth. History may have buried them in the footnotes, but their example still whispers across centuries, honor is not given. It is chosen.